there was a few courses I took in my undergrad. I really enjoyed kind of the organizational behavior aspect of HR. So I started pursuing human resources for a couple of years. And while I was doing that, though, I found myself drawn more and more to programming. I was doing more work, Excel macros, dabbling in Access databases. I really liked the data aspect of it and the problem-solving aspect of it. So I went back to school to study IT. And coming out of that, I ended up with a first job with Deloitte consulting as a programmer. Ironically enough, over in Paris, I followed my girlfriend at the time. She had a transfer over to Paris, and I was able to get a job. This was in the late 90s, so a while ago, before Y2K. That seems like distant history right now. Was with Deloitte for a couple of years, and which was a good experience, learning lots about their frameworks and methodologies and approaches to consulting and to programming. And then I left and joined a startup, like so many people were doing back in the early 2000s. I ran the IT team for the startup, and I was there for about 7 to 8 years. Eventually moved home to Toronto, kind of a personal decision. My wife and I moved back, and I joined a consulting firm, KPMG, in their IT advisory group. I wanted to get back into consulting as a way, one, because I enjoy the work, and two, having been away now for eight plus years over in Europe, it was a really good way to start to reestablish kind of a professional network that I had lost while I was working overseas. So I was at KPMG for about 4 to 5 years, and then an opportunity popped up where I was able to leave and become an independent consultant, a contractor, doing program and project management. It was with a former client, and she made me just a compelling offer that I couldn't refuse, and it gave me the opportunity to kind of go out on my own and try working on my own. I did that for about 10 years, really enjoyed it, and then but made a decision a couple of years ago now to join Capco. I started first consulting to Capco as an independent contractor, and then a couple of years in, really liked the place and decided to join full time. So that was in 2019 that I joined, and joined the leadership team at the firm. And as I mentioned, I focus really on large-scale transformational projects at financial institutions. So it's really, Capco focuses on the financial sector. We work with banks and insurance firms. That's it. So real strong industry focus there. And we do a wide variety of work. A lot of it in the digital space, where we're heavy on kind of design and build activities from a software development perspective. So that's my background. That's about 25 years in a couple minutes, and let me know where I am today, and happy to be here talking with all of you.
Sean, you also got a quick question in the chat about your background from Emily.
Oh, thanks. So Emily says, I was in management and accounting, now in web. Did you have any prior experience, and how did you land your first job? So my very first job, I think you mean the one at Deloitte, probably. So I had a couple of years of HR, and I think I got there through, originally I had done a co-op as part of a program at Seneca College, which gave me a few months, and then I applied to some jobs in the area and was able to get one. The one at Deloitte was interesting. I got the opportunity originally through networking, and my wife was pivotal in doing that. My girlfriend at the time, and she was kind of doing some networking from me over in Paris while I was here in Canada. Landed a few interviews, and was just successful in the interview process. I think what helped me at the time was I brought a you would never do this anymore, but I brought a printed portfolio of my work. I showed some of the the UI design work that I had done. I had like printouts of code I had written. There were some other deliverables. Essentially, it was kind of a collection of deliverables. And at the time, and remember, this was a long time ago, right? So this was in 98, 99. That made the discussion very real about what, as a relatively new grad, I was with only a couple of years of experience in an unrelated field, I had something tangible I could show and demonstrate that showed I was able to actually do what I was saying, what was indicated on my resume. And I think that really helped. That helped to sell me as someone that this is real. It's not vaporware that I'm talking about here. I think now, of course, I would be showing it on a laptop or an iPad, and it would be hosted on the cloud. Back then it was on paper. That was just a lot easier to deal with, but I think the principle is probably the same. Does that help? All right, thanks, Emily. Okay, so we're talking about some large projects, and for big corporations. I don't know if any of you have any experience in this area or not, but just wanted to get some thoughts either on the chat or just come off mute and feel free to speak up. What do you think some challenges might be doing development work at a very large client like a bank, as opposed to working on a smaller project at a smaller organization? Hard to make a difference. Like Emily says, yeah. So one of the things is trying to actually see an impact or the result of all of your effort. So these projects can be hard, very challenging, and sometimes they kind of get lost, right? There's a sense of being a big cog in a wheel. So that's definitely on a personal level that can definitely be a challenge. You want to feel like you're having an impact. Yeah, how large your team is and the departments that you work with. That's right. You tend to need bigger teams because there's more things to do, right? There's more governance that comes along with big companies, big projects. Certainly in regulated industries like financial services. As a result, you need to interact or interlock with a larger number of departments, and you need more people to do that, or your project's going to take longer. You kind of one trade-off for the other. Lots of restrictions, lots of procedure to get the manager and the project approved. Yeah, absolutely. There's usually a whole host of kind of different gates that you need to go through. In order to do so, there's a lot of documentation that you're preparing. It's all for very good reasons, but it's time consuming for sure, and it can feel like you're not, it's preventing you from actually getting to the work that you want to do, which is cutting code, testing it, getting it into production. Yeah, you can't touch everything. That's right. So there's definitely more segregation of duty. That's big. It's certainly big in financial services, and it's very typical in any large organization where you have, for example, teams that are allowed to touch production, and the developers are generally not allowed to, and they keep those things segregated to make sure that there's some kind of governance or oversight of what is being put into production. So for sure, there's examples like that. And the same thing goes to other specialties as well: information security, security assessments of the code that you're writing, what you're putting into prod, and the list goes on. So I think I've got those are some great thoughts there. We've touched on a number of them here, but some examples that came to my mind when I was thinking about this: figuring out how to navigate the organization. Even that in and of itself can be a real challenge. And while org charts exist, knowing who to call or what process you need to follow isn't always obvious. So you can spend quite a bit of time building up kind of a bit of a knowledge base around how do you navigate around this place. We talked about corporate standards and gating being things that are required in mature large organizations. You've almost always got regulatory requirements of some kind to deal with. The banking obviously is very heavy on that, but most industries have it, and the bigger you are, the more you are kind of the more difficult it can be to prove that you're meeting the regulations. Audit. So large publicly traded companies or any large organization that has an internal audit function will often audit your large projects. If they have a material impact either to the customer or internally, or they've just got a very large budget and it represents a material spend, you're going to be audited, and you need to kind of be ready for that and prepare to spend some hours on that as well. Business versus tech is something you see a lot of in large organizations. It ebbs and flows. It gets better or worse depending on the kind of the business cycle that we're in or the people involved. But there is often still an inevitable split almost between the business folks on the team and the tech folks on the team, and they're not always talking the same language. And part of your job leading the project is to bring those groups together. Stakeholder management. So in addition to just business and tech, figuring out who all your stakeholders are, you've got your obvious ones that are directly sponsoring the project. And then there's other influencers. You need to build a good understanding of who those people are, so you can make sure that you're communicating appropriately to them and helping them meet their needs as well. We talked about segregation of duty already, and then just generally communication and coordination. So it requires more effort and more thought and planning into how you're going to communicate with a larger team than it does with a smaller team. So there's just some energy that needs to go into that as well. So those are just some examples of some of the kinds of differences you might find with a big enterprise project. So we're going to get into a case study right now and do a walkthrough of this is a real project I had a few years ago at one of my clients. And we were dealing with a replacement, essentially. We needed to replace the bank's online and mobile banking platforms. They had an old one. It was very costly. The run rate was through the roof. It was a product-based solution, which meant it was configurable off the shelf, um, and it was no longer meeting their needs. They had a very old-looking user interface with limited ability to modify it. It was costing them too much to maintain, and they weren't able to upgrade it because of all of the customizations that they had made to it. And they were starting to lose ground competitively in this space. You have a creaky old online and mobile banking platform, doesn't look good. You're not going to win new customers, certainly of younger generations. So there was a desire not only to replace this, but to springboard it. In other words, to help use this platform to drive marketing to support some growth targets. So, building a lot of hype around the new online and mobile banking platform. So the solution at a very high level that we came up with was for us to do a custom build project. So we were going to build from scratch a new online banking solution and a new mobile platform for iOS and Android. We were going to be integrating a number of their features that you have to offer to banking customers. The ability to transfer money A to A, which is account to account, P2P or person to person, and then bill pay for paying your bills. So we had to integrate those different platforms. We had to do a data migration. There was data that was actually stored in the old online and mobile banking system that needed to be transferred over into the new platform. And then a subset of those customers were really had kind of grown from really small businesses to be sizable enough that they needed to move out of the retail banking solution and into a different online business banking solution. So that was really our scope of what we needed to do and how we were going to go about tackling it. So requirements, I mean, I think I'm gonna assume all of you do some banking online or on a mobile phone. It's standard stuff. There's other than some edge cases, the core of what you go online or on your mobile phone to do when you log into your bank's app is the same. You need to authenticate. You need to prove you are who you say you are to get access to your money. You want to see your account summary and your transactions. What are all my accounts at the institution? What's my transaction history? You may want to set up notifications and alerts. For example, if paycheck comes in, you want to be notified, or if your bank balance drops below or above a certain amount, you want to be notified. You may have some personal financial management tools that are in there as well, some budgeting, setting some goals, savings goals, and so on. And then you want to be able to move money around, pay your bills, move money from one account to another one, from your checking, your savings account, for example, or to send it to someone else if you want to get money over to a friend. And then there's doing some of that on your mobile phone as well, mobile cash and mobile check deposit. Mobile check deposit is very common here in Canada, taking a photo of a check, depositing it. Mobile cash, we don't see that so much here in Canada yet. Maybe the next generation of ATMs will have that, but that's where instead of using a debit card, you open up your mobile app on your phone, it shows a QR code, you scan it on the ATM, and then you've authenticated essentially in lieu of using your PIN and your debit card, and you can withdraw some cash or perform different functions on your ATM. We also needed to build an administration tool, so for the internal bank employees at the branches and at the call centers. So if someone, for example, forgets their password, you can reset their password, and we can do an audit, kind of provide audit logging and reporting, so an agent can see the trail of where the customer has been. If they're running into some other kind of problem, I can't pay my bill, then the agent is better able to help them out and can see where they've been. From a non-functional perspective, we had some requirements that were to support growth. The bank was intending to grow. They had 5-year growth targets of about 20% per year. So we needed to size it appropriately and allow it to be able to scale. It had to support high availability. All banking applications do, multi-site. And we were migrating just under 1 million customers as part of that data migration. Any comments or questions here on the requirements? All right. So in order to do this, The a very simplified architecture. I've got 2 slides on architecture here to share with you how we built it. This is, simplified view. We had our user interface, an authentication layer, 2 layers of services, channel services layer, and an enterprise service bus layer, and then the backend product systems where all the data is stored and the transactions actually happen. So your UI layer obviously is for your presentation. We had one for online and one for mobile, and we built that using Angular 2 at the time and Ionic. And Ionic did the kind of the translation from the Angular code into mobile-friendly code that could be packaged up for iOS and Android. Worked pretty well. A few issues that we ran into, but we were able to resolve those. That was I would use it again. By the way, that was great. It avoided us having to write and maintain 3 different code bases, which you would need to do if we'd done native development in iOS and Android. Ionic worked pretty well overall. I'd take those few issues we ran through versus having to maintain 3 separate kind of code bases and streams of activity there.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in for 1 sec. So for those of you who don't know, Ionic is basically a cross-platform solution that allows you to build an application with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and then compile it down to a native iOS app or Android app. So it allows you to have a single code base, and most of what you're doing is actually building the app in web technologies. Yes, it is called the Ionic framework. So it's opposed to, for example, using a native Java version like Kotlin, or it's a hybrid mobile app with web technologies.
Yeah, that's right, Rich. Thanks for that. Our authentication layer we needed to build. We used ISAM, which was the bank's kind of enterprise standard for authentication, and we used RSA for step up. So step up was triggered under a variety of different circumstances, but that's first time login, first time on a new device. If you're in a new geography, you might get stepped up, and that would require a second type of authentication, a second factor of authentication. So you might need to receive a 6-digit code on your phone and enter that in, for example, in addition to your username and password. So that was handled through RSA. By the way, that caused an enormous amount of problem with the aging population in the first few months of our go live. Our agents were explaining like basic steps of how to use your mobile phone to a fairly older clientele. It's stereotypical, but it was real. I think we had all underestimated how difficult it would be for some to get a 6-digit code on their phone and enter it in to support their password. So then the services layer. So in what is a very common architecture, we had a channel services layer and an enterprise services layer. So the channel services layer is used to handle, it's for the logic that handles the presentation of data and the functions that are specific to the user interface to which it's being displayed. These were built using RESTful APIs and microservices. I think we had about 16 microservices in total. And so the channel services job really is to take the data that's being provided from the back end via the enterprise services and render it specifically for use in the particular channel, whether it's online or mobile. The enterprise service bus has a set of services that are the main intermediation layer for all of the business functionality. So the business logic lives there, and its purpose is really to abstract away the back-end product system. So when you send through a request like get customer name, it'll figure out what system it needs to go into to get, and it's going to bring it back in a certain format that you require. All right, so in this particular case, these services were built and hosted on TIBCO and Data Power platforms. And then ultimately the backend product systems, we had very few changes to do to those. These are the big mainframes and other data repositories that sit in the back end of the banks, and they're the books of record really for the various different transactions and customer data. So if you take that kind of vertical layer and lay it out horizontally, a bit more detail here. This is what a very simplified kind of architectural view of a banking application looks like. Starting at the left, you have your different user interfaces. You go through the authentication layer, and you hit your channel services layer. Right? And you would come into your channel services. You might have some amount of data that's specific to the channel that would be stored in a channels database. For example, if you give people the opportunity to give a nickname to an account, Bank account could be a savings account, and you turn it into, I'm saving for my comic book collection savings account. You would store data like that in the channels database. There's distributed caching that we used. We also connected up to different third-party services. So we needed some services that would allow us to connect up to them. And then there was some of the content that's served up is done by a CMS or a content management system. So there were services for that as well. All of that flowed through that enterprise service bus layer. They built about 150 new services in total to support all of those different banking functions that we needed and to connect up to the different backend systems and third-party systems that were providing the data and the transactional history. So there's the RSA there, all of the core banking systems, the product catalog, which is where the banks store their different kinds of products, so different kinds of accounts, checking account, savings account, a mortgage, a credit card. And then there's the enterprise data warehouse, which is just an enormous data lake where customer data is stored. All historical transactions are kind of tracked in there. And then I mentioned kind of the third-party systems. I mean, some banks have run these internally. In this particular case, it was an external third party that was providing the bill pay functionality and the ability to transfer from account to account and person to person, and do check credit, and also do personal financial management, some of that goal setting and budget setting that I was talking about. So at a very simplified architectural level, this is what we were building out. Any questions here before we move on? All right, I think we got a question coming up at the end of this one, which is around team size. So integrated operating model. This is how we organized our team to build this app. So we talked about functionally what we were building and some of the non-functional requirements. We talked about the architecture for what we were building. We chose to build our team really with the build out, the set of activities that were being done to support the build out of the user design and build of the user interface and the channel services were all done in an agile manner. And the rest of the project, as is very common for programs of this size, were done in a more waterfall kind of style and approach. So the agile piece is the stuff at the top there. We used the Scrum methodology. We had 4 different teams, each with its own product owner. And they were roughly organized by functional area within the app. So the first team was called the foundation team, and they did all of the authentication, and they built the initial framework and kind of information architecture for the UI that was being used, that would then be consumed by all of the other teams. So they built kind of that standard initial framework layer, and then all the authentication. And authentication is used not just in the initial login, but also throughout any kind of customer journey or interaction that a customer is doing, to continue to make sure that whatever data you're showing to the customer, that customer has the is A, authenticated, and B, authorized to see it. Our second team was core servicing, we called it. This is the first core main reason you would come to log into your online bank is to see your transactions. So I want to see a list of all my accounts, maybe my closed accounts. I want to see my transaction history. I want to be able to page through it, search for different transactions, and so on. So that's kind of core servicing. And the money movement piece was the stuff like transferring the money account to account, person to person, or paying bills. And then finally, we had the admin stream. So this was building that back-end admin tool that were used by the agents that I mentioned. That was the responsibility for that team there. The team is structured in kind of what we call a streams and components model. Those are the streams, the horizontal streams that I just referred to, deliver end-to-end business value. And they start from the product owner defining the requirements up front, going through the design and the development and then testing before kind of workable, usable, deployable code pops out the other end. The components part are the verticals. So they're things like the product owners and the BDAs, the UX and UI designers, and the devs and the testers. And what we did is we put leads on each of those verticals to ensure consistency of practice across all the different streams, so that we didn't have four different teams doing things entirely differently, but there was some real consistency of practice at the beginning and then opportunity for sharing lessons learned via retrospectives and so on. As people found things that worked and they didn't, they could share that information across the other streams. So we had leads in kind of each of those different areas. The stuff along the bottom, we had teams within the project that were directly responsible for those activities. And then there were also a number of other kind of secondary sets of teams that were not directly part of the project, but that they needed to support some work. So a great example is infrastructure. We needed sysadmins and DBAs to build servers for hosting, build the databases that we're going to be using. So we need to feed specs into them. They had an intake process. So we never knew exactly how many people they had working on that. We had one or two people dedicated on our team to manage that and oversee it. But then those kind of distributed teams would go off, do their thing, and come back. So we had to have people to kind of keep on top of that. So there's a few comments flowing in here. So enterprise service bus, that's great. Thanks, Rich, for jumping in there. And then the question from Emily, are each team dependent on each other like a chain in a factory, or does front end work with UX simultaneously? It's about time management. Okay, great question. So I don't think I have a slide that illustrates this, so just bear with me. So we did this in sprints. Our sprints were 2 weeks long. At the beginning of each sprint, we would take in a certain amount of work in the form of user stories. The user stories were, by the way, are you guys writing requirements in the form of user stories? Rich, is that a concept that the group's familiar with?
We didn't really this year. We have in the past, but we didn't this year.
Okay, that's fine. So just really quickly, a user story is a particular way of writing requirements that is very friendly to Agile. It's very common in Scrum, but other Agile methods as well. And it's just a style of writing requirements, and it starts with the user in mind, or the customer, whoever's using your product. So it would be like, as a user, I want to log in to my online banking platform and immediately see my list of accounts and the current balance. So that would be an example of a user story, right? And then so that would be one story that's taken in, and it would get assigned a certain number of points based on the complexity of building and developing that. And the teams would commit to how many stories they were going to achieve or complete within each sprint. And we would have demos at the end of the sprint where everyone would show off what they'd done, and they'd look at a burn down chart and say, okay, we thought we took in 100 story points at the beginning. We only managed to get 80 done. There's another 20. We're partway done, but we weren't able to get to end of job and testing, so we couldn't close them. And we're going to cover those in the following sprint. We then had to stagger stuff, because as much as you would like to get an entire team's work all done in one sprint, on bigger projects, that's not always possible. So what you start running is ahead or behind of other sprints. So in the case of UX and business requirements, the BAs would typically lead the charge, and they would have requirements done two sprints ahead of when the devs needed it. One sprint ahead of when the devs needed to start the work on the story, the UX and the UI would get done. So they'd be one sprint ahead. And then you'd have the devs doing the work. And then you probably have the testers. They would start some testing in sprint, but we were very rarely able to complete all testing within one sprint. So they would finish up the testing and close the stories in the following sprint. So we would be staggering the work across multiple sprints in an effort to kind of keep feeding the funnel for the subsequent team that needs to consume what was being done by the previous team. Emily, does that make sense? Cool. All right. Storyboards in another course. Yeah, that's a way of doing it as well. Very, very related. And you end up there's a suite of different tools out there that are really well suited for writing user stories, tying them into tests that need to be done as well from a QA perspective to validate that the stories have been fully realized and achieved, and you're okay to close off the story. So we use Jira. That's a very common one, the Atlassian suite, Jira and Confluence, but there's a whole bunch of them out there. Trello is a really common one as well. Yeah, there's many of them out there for kind of storyboarding and writing user stories that way. All right, I think I don't know if we have a poll here, Rich, or we just wanted to ask the class to get
yeah, I'll throw it up as a quick poll. Put the link up. It's our usual poll everywhere link, but I'll put it in the chat.
So I think we wanted to try to get your thoughts on how big you think the team might be, given what you've heard so far around what it is that we're building.
So I'll just turn on my share for a second, and then
Sure.
Sean, you can always just grab control back.
Yep.
So go to paulev.com/richfreeman521.
I'm seeing the budget one.
Yeah, so not in terms of people, but just in terms of the cost. So how much did the bank have to pay?
Rich, sorry, I was asking actually about the
Oh,
number of people.
okay.
I've added that in. I've added that number of people in.
Okay, hang on, bear with me. Okay, sorry. So the question should be, how big was the team? Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. I think the budget one's coming up.
Okay. All right, we'll come back to the budget. So how big was the team? How many people do you think would have been needed to build this project? So put your guess in.
I think the 22,000 is
Yeah.
the budget maybe rather than
Probably
the
budget. 10.
Yeah. 40.
1,000. Okay. 50. Okay.
20, 30, working with different departments. 15. He was very overworked. Yeah, I wish I could do all this. 15. This is fun.
All right. So we've got basically from 10 to 1,000, and most of the guesses seem to be in the neighborhood of like a few dozen.
Okay.
Looking at. So you can just share again. It'll just take control back.
Let's see. Share.
And then you'll have to reopen your chat window because it'll go away again.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean. That's an annoying feature. All right. All right, sounds good. Okay, so how many people? We had 99 direct project team members who were literally every day in the same office, and then I put a plus because we had distributed teams as well. And so I think probably we were closer to the 200 mark, with the second 100 group not being full time on the project, but coming off and on at different points in time based on need. So what I've got at in each of the boxes are the count of the individual groups. And then on the far right is kind of a list of what the subtotal is. So our project delivery office, I was part of that. We had some PMs and some project control officers as well that were helping manage and oversee the whole thing, keep track of the schedule, our risks, our RAID log risks and action items, issues, decisions, produce the innumerable amount of PowerPoint decks that we need to provide status updates and so on a weekly basis and to the exec steerco. The gray boxes were the leads. We had leads in each of those areas. The testing one looks large. There was one overall QA lead, and then working for her, we had one kind of test automation lead, and then we had a couple people that focused on performance testing, and I just put them in there. Here's where it's kind of most interesting, I think, relative to theory, is our agile teams were 17 or 18 people in size each. Not including the enterprise service bus development, because for that we had one PM, and then she would take that over to that bank's distributed team, and they would do work kind of on their own. So if you look at the theory of typical agile theory for Scrum, they'll tell you that optimal size is somewhere around 8, varying between like 7 and up to about 10 at the max, but 8, 9, 10 is really sort of your sweet spot for it. So this is really agile at scale. We had, 4 Scrum teams. We ran a Scrum of Scrums to try to keep them in sync, and we were more than double the size of what an optimal size is. It can be done. It's not ideal, right? It makes communication within the team a little more difficult. But we needed this size to get this volume of work done in the time frame that we had allowed, that we were given. So definitely running agile at scale is doable. It's not always optimal, but you need to find ways to make it, I guess, to make it work and to keep that communication flowing through the teams as they continue on their journey. Yeah, and then anywhere there's a plus, I think it just indicates that really what we had on our core team was like a PM or a contact point with an external team. And then we don't really have line of sight in exactly how many people they were providing services, and they would just get stuff done. So they owed us deliverables by certain dates. Whether they needed one person or 10 people to do it didn't matter, except from a budget perspective. So we weren't tracking their headcount, but just the dollars associated with that. And Rich, you make a comment here of the UX front end, back end kind of ratio. Is that something you guys have talked about in the team?
Well, I think also just in terms of, people's expectations job wise, how many jobs are there? Because this group, we're really learning all of the program split among all of these components. So it's interesting to note for a big project, this is how many developers you need versus how many designers you need, and how that development ratio breaks down as well.
Yeah, and this project's a really good example in a way, because it was really developing the entire thing. Like the whole platform was a brand new build, custom build. We do have different projects, right? And so projects are unique. So there's one that we're doing right now, actually for the same client, on a different application, and we're just redoing their front end. So we're not touching the back end, any of the services, or minimal or very, very light touch. So in that case, we're heavy on the UX, UI, BAs, and the front end devs, but very little on the back end. So you'll do that too. That's like a UX refresh that happens as well. This was full stack all the way up and down. And this is I think a good example of the kinds of ratios, as you mentioned, between your designers up front, your devs, and your QA as well. All right. So in terms of planning, you start a lot of planning up front. We start during our proposal stage. We're a consulting firm, so we've got to come forward with proposals that include not just how much we think it's going to cost, but how long we think it's going to take. And so we try to come up with that with whatever limited knowledge. There's always constraints on how much you know. You try to put some boundaries around the scope, and you use those to drive your estimates for how many people you think you're going to need, how much effort it's going to take, and how long it's going to take. And you will do typically high-level planning at the outset as part of a proposal, and that's usually about as far as you can get. Typically then, once you get into the very first phase of the project, the initiation phase, is when you can really devote the time to doing some detailed planning. That's when you typically get more access to internal resources, the bank's resources in this case, so we can talk to them. We've got more specific requirements. We can feed them in whatever format they need to say, okay, get us a more accurate estimate of what it's going to cost and how long it's going to take you to deliver your piece of this puzzle. We had to build out integrated project plans. We used MS Project for that, very, very typical. On a program this size, we had a large number of PMs scattered across a number of those different work streams. They each had their own plan in MS Project, and then that was fed into our project management office, where we had an integrated plan that didn't contain 100% of the individual line items from the different plans, but the key milestones. So it was kind of a rolled up view. And this was still a material effort. It was about half of a person for the entire life of the project to kind of continue to maintain that integrated plan, but so critical, so you know if you're on track or at risk of slipping off plan. The initial plan that we put together, again in PowerPoint, I spend 90% of my day in PowerPoint, the rest of it in email, I think. Was kind of an 18-month approach to this. It assumed a big bang approach at the end. And I'm not going to go through all the different details, but you can see it's broken down in annual quarters. And the phases I guess the swim lanes for each of the different project areas more or less line up with either the scope that we talked about at the beginning in terms of the functional scope, or that operating model, the team structure that we just looked through. So the channel delivery, that's the business requirements, that's the UX and the UI design, and building the code for the front end and the channel services layer is that top stream. And then we had a separate stream for testing, because you do in-sprint testing, but then you've got kind of testing at the end of each of the releases from an integrated testing perspective, as well as performance testing and UAT that needs to happen when things are completely built or almost built and ready to go. That enterprise service bus layer did quarterly releases, so we had to fit into their quarterly release schedule. Those are the stars that are there. We had our whole data conversion. I don't spend a lot of time right now talking about data conversion, but that's a long-running stream with a lot of data analysis and mapping of source systems to target systems, what you need to do to get from the source to the target, and how you might need to transform the data in between. And then a lot of testing to make sure what you're bringing over makes it to where it needs to get to. We're talking about customers' data here, financial data. It's super important to make sure that you don't miss any dollar signs or cents along the way. There's a readiness stream. This is really business readiness for the change. So any large or small, really any new piece of software that you're introducing into the business drives change. It might need, maybe there's a new business process that needs to change. People need to be trained on how to use the software internally. Externally, there's awareness to customers. Hey, next time you log in, you're going to see something really different. And in fact, for banking, there's some regulatory requirements, especially stringent in the States, which is where this one was being deployed, where you need to give advance notice, like 90 days notice when something material is being changed to your banking. And we were doing that. So we had a lot of lead time we needed to give the customers. In terms of and also the agent training as well. Agents needed to be aware of A, how to use this new admin tool, and B, customers are going to be calling in because they couldn't figure out how to log in. You got to be ready to help them out. And how do you do that? And so preparing call scripts for them and knowledge-based material. So quite a bit of prep needed to go into that to make sure that they were ready to give service to their customers. The business banking migration piece, again, that was that subset of customers that had kind of morphed from retail customers into business customers, and they need to get out of there and into the online business banking platform. We had the enterprise infrastructure, so the hosting of the application, the build out of the servers and the storage for that. We had a couple changes that we were making to the core banking platform. So very, very long running changes. I think they make changes to that, if not quarterly, once every 6 months. You don't touch it very often. And we had a couple changes we needed to make there. And then we had all of the readiness around actual go live, doing final dress rehearsals, getting ready for the conversion event, the go live event, rehearsing that, doing a pilot with a small set of customers to test it out in production, and then our final big bang go live. So that at a super high level is an 18 to 24 month kind of view of what the project looked like. I mentioned that you get into some more detailed planning once you kick off the initiation phase. So then this is what the first 90 days of the project looked like. It was really focused on standing stuff up, building those initial set of deliverables that you need to kind of get the project on a good foundation and ready to go. So we had to put in place a governance structure, a vendor management strategy, communications plan, a plan for knowledge management, a change management strategy, the delivery plan, figure out what are all the artifacts we needed to pass each of the gates internally and be allowed to go live in production. Nail down commercial agreements with all the different vendors that are involved. Set out the budget. All of that was just PMO stuff in the top set of the top stream up there. And then there were foundational things that we were doing for the delivery streams as well. So doing some upfront UX research and thinking of high level strategies for what the design is going to look like. What are our UX principles going to be? Building some initial wireframes and getting approval on those from the internal stakeholders. And the foundation team started early with a set of Sprint Zero activities, which was really setting up the initial tooling that we were going to be using for the code, the different repositories, building out the DevOps pipeline, getting the kind of all the nuts and bolts set up so that when you start bringing in more developers, they can be productive on day one. We were also going through all the architecture design and approval process along the way. And then eventually about 4 to 5 to 6 weeks in, we started sprinting with our other teams, and they started kind of coming up off the ground and building out initial wireframes and UI designs, and then eventually working code for each of the other different component areas of the online and mobile banking apps. So it's a very, very busy first 90 days. All right, I think this is the last thing we're going to do before we take a break, Rich, and this is really thinking about, we're going to go to the poll, and just thinking about everything you've heard in terms of the size of the team, the requirements, the timeline, and so on, and knowing this is a big, heavy, enterprise project at a bank. How much do you think it's going to cost? I think that's the way we framed it up in the poll. Is that right, Rich?
Yep. So you can go back, same poll link. So go to the poll and let us know. So either I can share. Yeah, I guess I can share here. So what would this project cost? Oh, sorry. It should be active now. You may just have to refresh. The same poll link as before. You can see it on my screen. pollev.com/richfreeman521. Tell us what you think the overall, what did the bank pay for this?
And then I see Emily's also posted a question, so we'll come back to that one too. Funny, they kind of scroll off the screen, I guess, as new people answer the question, right?
Yeah. So we're from 35,000. We've got one answer about 2 million. Okay, if you haven't guessed, feel free to throw an estimate in. So here's our range.
Yeah.
A few under 100,000, a few that are several 100,000. We've got $500,000 and $2 million seems to be the upper range.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so, oh, I've got to share again, Rich.
Sure, yeah, you can share. We'll take a pause in a minute once we have a look at this.
Yeah, sounds good. Share. Let's pull up my chat window again here again. All right. So we came in a little higher than I guess the average spend of the guesses there, a lot higher actually. So our overall budget was $19 million, was what this project ended up costing at the end. It was higher than originally estimated. I would say it's probably on the high end of a project for this size, due to a number of kind of complexities that we encountered along the way, and some stuff at the end. Here's the breakdown. How does that break down, right? How do you get to 90 million? That's a big number. So our UX and requirements, $6 million on that. Design was 4. Dev was the biggest at 21 million. And again, that was the front end design, the channel services, front end development, the channel services development, those enterprise services development, as well as some of the changes that needed to be made to some of the downstream systems like the product systems and so on. QA was about 15 million. So again, good healthy number there. You want that to be, that's not an unusual ratio between dev and QA. QA could have even been a little bit more relative to that dev number. The business spent 10 million, or 5 million for our conversion activities that we talked about. And the business banking piece was a separate 8 million. Our PMO was quite expensive, to be honest, at 13 million. That's very expensive. That wasn't Capco that was driving that for the most part. That was internal bank costs. And again, tied really to some of the complexities of just a lot of overhead and a lot of project management work needed to get stuff done within a bank. Hosting and infrastructure was low at 3 million of expense. Some of it was capitalized, so you don't see it there. And there was about 7 million spent on third parties. So all of that adds up to 90 million. Again, if you'd asked me at the beginning what I thought the project would cost, I probably would have said 60. This ended up being kind of more expensive over time. Again, due to a few changes that happened in the middle of the project, and then some changes to the way the bank wanted to roll out to customers as well, drove the price up significantly. I like your last comment there, Rich. So I'll tell you what, let's see, I can answer Emily's question now, or we can tackle it a little bit later after break. Let's see, I think, you know what, I'm happy to do it right now if we want. Rich, up to you.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you go ahead? And I think Emily may have sent that question to you privately, so you may just have to read the question out because I don't know it's captured for the rest of the class.
I'm so sorry. I just see that right now, Emily. My apologies. I think so. The question, but I do think it's a good question. It's a question of you know, in a team like this, I'm just going to go back up to the here we go. We'll get rid of the numbers here. So in a team like this, what would the ratio be maybe of junior devs versus senior devs, right? In other words, could you envision new grads fitting into a team like this, right? And what would they do? So absolutely, right? So in many ways, having a big project even affords you more opportunities to have junior devs working under the supervision of more senior devs, which is a great learning opportunity. So you know where we had the junior folks were anywhere where we had more than one person in a team. So if you remember here, you know our BAs were a mix of junior and senior. Same with our UX and our UI design folks. Front end devs, we had some new grads as well as some very senior folks. So we probably had on the front end devs, we probably had for each team, we had one senior with you know somewhere around 10 to 12 years of you know of hardcore development experience, for example. One senior lead, and then some more junior folks. And it was the same on the back end dev. The back end dev, I think we had probably one. The ratio there was a little different. We might have had one junior and to a couple of seniors, just due to the nature of the work that was being done there. And the same thing on the testing. So we had the opportunity to have a nice blend. It's a way to you don't always need senior people to do work, right? There's like lots of great stuff that a more junior person can do. Working again, kind of under supervision guidance of a more senior person. Great way to learn. Helps us manage our costs overall. And again, same thing. Like you don't need people with 15 years of coding experience doing all your coding, right? There's lots of great work and way to share, and for people to develop along the way.
Great answer. An excellent question, Emily. Thanks for that. Okay, it's 10:01, everyone. So I'm going to suggest that I will stop the recording, and why don't we take a 10-minute break here, get up, stretch our legs. I need a water refill as well, and we will resume in 10 minutes. Okay, we'll see you back here shortly.
All right, thanks. See you shortly, folks.